I didn't expect the sentence that finally ended my place in the family to be delivered so casually, like someone commenting on the weather. We were sitting around the dining table, plates half cleared, the room thick with that post-dinner silence where everyone pretends they're comfortable. My mother leaned back in her chair, looked at me the way you look at a cracked tile you've been meaning to replace, and said, "You know, Felix, you're kind of living proof of failure." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even sound angry. She sounded certain. My father nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if sealing the statement. Someone laughed, a short, nervous sound. No one corrected her. I'm 31, old enough to know when something is a joke, and old enough to know when it's a verdict. For context, I wasn't always the problem child. I wasn't rebellious, reckless, or dramatic. I was the quiet one. The kid who did what he was told, stayed out of trouble, got decent grades, and didn't ask for much. My younger brother, Aaron, was the star. The athlete. The one with the loud laugh and the big plans everyone believed in before he even said them out loud. My parents built their expectations around him like a house around a load-bearing wall. I was extra space. Useful sometimes. Ignorable most of the time. Things really shifted after I decided not to follow the path they had mapped out for me. I didn't go into the family-adjacent business. I didn't take the safe job my uncle lined up. I chose something smaller, slower, and, according to them, embarrassing. I freelanced. I consulted. I built my income piece by piece instead of wearing a company logo on my chest. It paid my bills. It gave me independence. But it didn't give them bragging rights, and that, apparently, mattered more. At first, the comments were subtle. "So, still doing that little project thing? Have you thought about something more stable yet?" My mother loved the word stable. She used it the way people use the word normal, like a fence you're either inside or outside of. At family gatherings, conversations about careers somehow skipped over me, like my life was a commercial break everyone politely ignored. When I did speak up, I got smiles that didn't reach eyes, nods that said, "That's nice, anyway." Aaron, on the other hand, could do no wrong. When he changed jobs 3 times in 2 years, it was finding himself. When I stuck with my work for 5 years straight, it was being stuck. When he needed help with rent, my parents called it support. When I declined to lend money because I was investing it back into my business, it was selfishness. Same actions, different translations. The night everything finally cracked wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. It was just dinner. A routine visit. I almost didn't go. Something in my gut told me to stay home, to avoid the familiar tightness in my chest that always followed these evenings. But I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself family was family. That word still meant something to me back then. Dinner started politely enough. Small talk. Weather. A cousin's engagement. My father asked Aaron about his promotion for the 3rd time, as if hoping the story would improve with repetition. No one asked me anything beyond whether I wanted more potatoes. I didn't mind. Silence had become a skill. Then my mother brought up the house. Not my house. Their house. The one they loved to remind me I'd grown up in, but never really belonged to. She started talking about the future and making arrangements. Her eyes kept flicking to Aaron while she spoke, like a stage director cueing the lead actor. I listened, chewing slowly, already sensing where this was going. She sighed dramatically and said, "It's just hard, you know? Watching one child move forward, and another just not." That was the first hit. Light. Almost polite. I felt it anyway. I tried to deflect. Made a joke about taking my time, about not being in a rush to impress anyone. It landed poorly. My father set his fork down with a soft clink that somehow sounded louder than it should have. "Felix," he said, in that tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "We're just concerned. At some point, you have to admit when something hasn't worked." I asked him what, exactly, hadn't worked. That was my mistake. The room shifted. My mother leaned forward. Aaron suddenly found the table fascinating. And then came the sentence. Living proof of failure. Like my entire existence was a cautionary tale they could point to whenever someone asked why they pushed so hard with Aaron. Don't end up like him. Look what happens. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do. The laugh came out wrong. Too sharp. Too loud. My mother frowned, as if I'd confirmed her point by reacting at all. "If you're going to be like this," she said, waving her hand vaguely in my direction, "maybe it's better if you don't come around for a while. We don't need this kind of negativity." That word again. Negativity. The universal excuse. My father didn't argue. He didn't soften it. He just nodded, once more, like this was a reasonable boundary being set, not a door being quietly closed. I looked around the table, at the people who had watched me grow up, who had taken photos of me on my birthdays, clapped at my graduations, hugged me at holidays. No one met my eyes. No one said, "That's enough." The message was clear. I was tolerated until I became inconvenient. So I stood up. I thanked my mother for dinner. I told my father to take care. I told Aaron good luck. My voice sounded calm, even to me. That surprised me. Inside, something was collapsing, but on the outside, I felt steady, detached, like I was already stepping out of the room emotionally, even before my feet carried me away. At the door, my mother added one last thing, almost as an afterthought. "Maybe some time apart will help you figure things out." I turned back and said, "You're right." And I meant it. What I didn't say, what none of them realized, was that I take people at their word, especially when they're so clear about where I stand. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't send follow-up messages trying to explain myself. I went home, sat in the quiet of my apartment, and replayed the evening until the shock wore off and something colder took its place. That was the night I stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that had already decided I didn't belong. Over the next few weeks, the silence stretched. No calls. No check-ins. Holidays passed without invitations. It hurt more than I expected, but it also did something else. It gave me space. And in that space, I started to see patterns I'd been too close to notice before. Little assumptions. Old expectations. Quiet entitlements. I also started to notice how often my family had relied on things I'd set up, handled, or quietly managed over the years without ever acknowledging it. Accounts. Paperwork. Arrangements made under the assumption that I would always be there, even if I wasn't welcome at the table. I didn't rush to do anything about that. Not yet. I just noticed. I observed. I listened when, a month later, my phone finally buzzed with my mother's name on the screen. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail she left, her voice suddenly softer, more careful, talking about a small issue and how it would be so much easier if I could stop by and help sort something out. That was the moment I realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. I didn't call her back right away. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because I needed to hear that voicemail again without the sting of surprise clouding it. When I replayed it, what stood out wasn't what she said, but how she said it. That careful softness. The way she framed it as a favor I could do, not an obligation they were suddenly realizing they still depended on. "Just a small issue," she'd said. "You're always so good with these things." No apology. No acknowledgement of the last conversation we'd had. Just a quiet assumption that I'd step back into place when summoned. I waited 2 days before responding. Text only. Short. Neutral. I told her I was busy but could talk later in the week. She replied within seconds. Too fast. The relief was almost visible through the screen. That alone told me more than the words ever could. When we finally spoke, she eased into it slowly, like someone testing ice after a freeze. She asked how I'd been, whether work was going okay, and if I was still doing that freelance stuff. I answered politely, gave her nothing extra. Eventually, she circled back to the real reason for the call. There was an issue with some paperwork related to the house. Nothing serious, she assured me. Just confusing. And since I'd handled similar things before, it would really help if I came by. I reminded her, calmly, that she'd told me not to come around for a while. There was a pause. A small one, but heavy. "Well," she said, "that was emotional. You know how things get said in the heat of the moment." I almost laughed. Not out of humor, but out of disbelief. Living proof of failure. No longer welcome. Emotional. The revision happened so easily for her, it was almost impressive. I told her I'd think about it, and ended the call before she could push further. That should have been the end of it for a while. It wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, the messages started coming from different directions. My father sent a brief email asking if I had a copy of some documents he couldn't locate. An aunt texted, saying my mother was stressed, and it would mean a lot if I could be the bigger person. Aaron messaged me once, just a single line. "Mom's kind of freaking out. Can you help her out?" Not one of them apologized. Not one of them acknowledged what had been said to me. The narrative had already shifted in their minds. I wasn't the son they'd pushed away. I was the resource they were temporarily inconvenienced without. I agreed to meet my parents in person, but on my terms. Public place. Short visit. I told myself it was for closure. Part of me still wanted to believe there was a version of this where we talked things out. That maybe, if I explained how deeply that night had cut, they'd understand. That was probably naive. But old habits die hard. We met at a cafe halfway between their house and my apartment. Neutral ground. They were already seated when I arrived. My mother smiled too brightly. My father stood, shook my hand like I was a colleague, not his son. That alone tightened something in my chest. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather, traffic, the coffee. It all felt rehearsed. Finally, I asked what the issue was. My mother pulled out a folder. Thick, overstuffed. The kind of folder that screams disorganization disguised as importance. She started explaining, talking quickly, jumping between points. Something about refinancing. Something about tax adjustments. Something about needing signatures, maybe changes. I listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't a small issue. It was a mess. One they'd ignored for years because it was easier to let me handle it quietly whenever something came up. At one point, my father interrupted to say, "This is the kind of thing Aaron will eventually take over, of course. But until then, there it was. Temporary usefulness." I nodded, said I understood, and then asked a simple question. Why me? They both looked at me, genuinely confused. "You're good at this stuff?" My mother said, like that explained everything. I asked again, slower. Why me, after what you said to me? After telling me I wasn't welcome? My father cleared his throat. "We didn't mean it like that." My mother sighed, the way she did when she felt accused. "Felix, you're focusing on one sentence. We were talking about patterns. About concern. Concern. Another word that suddenly meant something else entirely. I told them I'd need time to review everything. I didn't promise to fix it. I didn't promise anything at all. Their faces tightened slightly, but they didn't push. Not yet. What I didn't tell them was that this meeting had settled something in me. Any lingering hope that they might see me differently had quietly burned out. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was entitlement. The real breaking point didn't come from my parents directly. It came a week later, from Aaron. He showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't given him my new address, but I wasn't surprised he'd found it. He always had a way of getting what he wanted without asking. He leaned against the doorframe like he owned the place, glanced around, and smirked. "Nice setup," he said. "Didn't expect this." I asked him what he wanted. He launched straight into it. Mom was stressed. Dad was annoyed. Things would go a lot smoother if I just helped out like I always had. He said it casually, like reminding someone to take out the trash. When I mentioned how they'd treated me, he shrugged. "Come on, Felix. You know how they are. You're taking this way too personally." That sentence landed harder than anything my parents had said, because it came from him, the golden child, the one who'd never had to question his place. He went on to say something that still echoes in my head. "Look, if you just made better choices, they wouldn't worry so much. You kind of put them in this position." There it was. The justification. Not only was I the failure, but I was also responsible for their behavior toward me. I felt something shift then. A line crossed. I told him to leave. He laughed, genuinely amused. "You're being dramatic." I opened the door and held it. He rolled his eyes but stepped out, pausing just long enough to add, "Don't forget who family is." After he left, I sat on my couch for a long time without moving. That conversation replayed itself on a loop, each pass stripping away another layer of doubt. They didn't just dismiss my feelings. They rewrote reality to make themselves right. A few days later, I found out just how far that rewriting went. I received an email notification from a service account I recognized immediately. One I'd helped set up years ago for my parents, back when they trusted me enough to handle things, but not enough to credit me for it. The subject line mentioned a change request. Curious, I logged in. What I saw made my stomach drop. They had tried to move forward without me, to change things quietly, to shift responsibilities, names, access, and they'd done it under the assumption that I wouldn't notice, or if I did, I'd just accept it. Buried in the request was a line that made everything else snap into focus. A note referencing Aaron as the sole point of contact, going forward, effective immediately. No discussion, no warning, just a quiet attempt to erase me while still benefiting from what I'd already put in place. I stared at the screen, the weight of it pressing down on me. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was betrayal. Calculated. Intentional. They'd told me I wasn't welcome, then tried to cut me out while still scrambling to clean up the mess they'd made. That was the moment something hardened inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Clearer. They wanted the benefits of family without the responsibility of treating me like one. They wanted access without accountability. And they had no idea how much ground that assumption was built on. I closed the laptop slowly, already aware that whatever came next would change things permanently. I just didn't know yet how much they were about to lose, or how quickly. After I closed the laptop, I didn't immediately jump into action. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send angry messages or demand explanations. I just sat there, staring at the blank wall across from my couch, letting the reality of it settle in. Betrayal is strange that way. It doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, slipping into your chest and hollowing something out without making a sound. For a while, I felt numb. Not devastated. Not furious. Just empty. Like the last thread tying me to the idea of family had finally snapped, and my brain hadn't caught up yet. I went through the next few days on autopilot. Work emails, client calls, groceries, laundry, all the mundane things that keep life moving even when something inside you has stalled. At night, though, it hit harder. I replayed every interaction from the past few years, every small comment I'd brushed off, every moment I'd downplayed to keep the peace. I thought about how often I'd made myself smaller in those rooms, quieter, easier to ignore. How often I'd convinced myself that if I just stayed calm enough, useful enough, patient enough, eventually they'd see me differently. That version of me felt painfully naive now. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights I couldn't shut my mind off. Other nights I slept too deeply, waking up disoriented, like I'd escaped something only to be dragged back by the same thoughts. I stopped answering messages entirely. When my phone buzzed with my mother's name again, I let it ring until it stopped. When my father emailed, I archived it without opening it. It wasn't a dramatic choice. It was survival. The lowest point came quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, of all times. I was sitting at my desk, staring at an invoice I'd already reviewed 3 times, when it hit me. If I stripped away what my family thought of me, if I stopped trying to disprove their version of my life, I didn't actually know who I was doing any of this for anymore. That question lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. For the first time in years, I wondered if they were right. Not about failure, but about me being disconnected, rootless, untethered. It's unsettling to realize how deeply other people's opinions can burrow into you, even when you consciously reject them. I didn't like that they still had that power. That realization hurt more than anything they'd said. So I did something I'd never really done before. I stopped, not just from them, but from the constant motion I'd used to outrun discomfort. I cleared my calendar for a week, told clients I'd be unavailable, turned off notifications. The silence was uncomfortable at first, but it forced me to sit with thoughts I'd been postponing for years. I asked myself hard questions. Why did I still crave approval from people who had never truly offered it? Why did I equate usefulness with worth? Why had I accepted conditional love as normal? The answers weren't flattering, but they were honest. When the fog began to lift, what surprised me most was not the anger I felt toward my family, but the anger I felt toward myself. Not self-hatred, something more constructive. Frustration at how long I'd allowed this dynamic to shape me. That frustration turned out to be fuel. I started small, practical. I revisited my finances, not because they were in trouble, but because I'd never really taken ownership of them in a way that felt intentional. I'd always operated defensively, making sure I could survive, not planning to grow. That shifted. I reorganized everything, closed unnecessary accounts, consolidated, created clear separation between my personal and professional life. Clean lines, clean boundaries. Then I looked at my work. For years, I treated it like something temporary, even though it had supported me consistently. A quiet part of me had always assumed I'd eventually need to graduate into something more respectable. That assumption wasn't mine. It was inherited. So I challenged it. I raised my rates. I refined my offerings. I stopped saying yes to projects that drained me just because I felt lucky to be asked. Some clients pushed back. I let them go. Others respected it immediately. Those relationships deepened. The work became more focused, more satisfying. I wasn't scrambling anymore. I was choosing. The more stable things became, the clearer my thinking got. Confidence crept back in. Not loud, not flashy, but steady. The kind that doesn't need validation because it's rooted in evidence. I could see, objectively, that my life wasn't a failure. It just didn't fit the narrow frame my family insisted on using. During this time, I didn't tell anyone in my family what I was doing. Not out of secrecy, but because it didn't occur to me to share anymore. That alone felt like progress. Ironically, as I began to rebuild internally, the pressure from them increased. My mother started leaving longer voicemails. Less careful now. More strained. She mentioned stress. Deadlines. How everything felt so complicated lately. My father sent an email with the subject line, "Need to talk." No greeting. No sign-off. Just that. Aaron texted once, casually, as if nothing had happened, asking if I'd figured things out yet. I didn't respond to any of it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their attempts to quietly shift things without me had failed. The systems they'd tried to reroute weren't as simple as they thought. They'd underestimated how interconnected everything was. How much relied on decisions made years ago. Decisions they hadn't understood at the time because they'd never bothered to ask. I became aware of the fallout indirectly. A third party reached out to me with a neutral question that carried an undercurrent of confusion. A process that had always run smoothly was suddenly stalled. Names didn't match. Authority was unclear. There were assumptions that no longer held. I answered carefully, factually. I didn't volunteer more than necessary. I didn't fix anything. I simply clarified what I was responsible for and what I was not. Each time I did that, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I wasn't sabotaging anyone. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was just no longer compensating for other people's neglect. The difference mattered. One evening, as I was locking up my apartment after a long walk, I realized I hadn't thought about proving anything to my family all day. Not once. The absence of that pressure felt almost foreign. Liberating. Still, the emotional fallout lingered. There were moments, unexpected ones, when grief hit out of nowhere. Seeing a father help his son move furniture. Hearing someone joke about family traditions. Those moments stung, reminding me of what I'd lost, or maybe what I'd never truly had. But alongside the grief was something new. Clarity. I started journaling. Not poetic, not dramatic. Just facts. Patterns. Observations. Writing things down stripped them of their power to swirl endlessly in my head. It also revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. The dynamic in my family wasn't accidental. It was structured, reinforced, protected, and it depended on me playing my role. Once I stopped, the imbalance became visible. That's when the calls shifted in tone. My mother left a voicemail that sounded closer to panic than frustration. She mentioned urgency and consequences. She said my father was upset, that Aaron was overwhelmed. She asked, no, told, me that this wasn't the time to hold grudges. I listened to it twice. Then I deleted it. Not because it didn't affect me, but because I finally understood that engaging emotionally was exactly what they wanted. If I argued, they could dismiss me as dramatic. If I explained, they could minimize it. Silence, on the other hand, forced them to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty was something they weren't used to. Meanwhile, my life kept expanding in small but meaningful ways. I reconnected with people I'd neglected while trying to maintain my place in my family. I accepted an invitation to collaborate on a project I'd once thought was beyond me. I started planning further ahead than just the next few months. The more grounded I became, the more I realized that whatever confrontation was coming, and I could feel it building, would not be about emotions anymore. It would be about structure, about responsibility, about consequences. I wasn't ready to confront them yet. Not because I was afraid, but because timing mattered. They were still scrambling, still assuming I'd eventually fold, still underestimating how much leverage they'd quietly handed me by treating me like an afterthought for so long. And when the moment came, when they finally realized that I wasn't coming back the way they expected, it wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. That realization settled in my chest like a promise. By the time I realized I was being underestimated on purpose, the pieces were already moving. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. An unfamiliar number. Normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was cautious, professional, and unmistakably confused. They asked if I was still involved with a certain arrangement tied to my parents' household. The wording was careful, like they were stepping around something fragile. I told them the truth, that I hadn't been involved for some time. that I hadn't authorized any recent changes, that I wasn't listed as a decision-maker anymore, as far as I'd been told. There was a pause, a longer one this time. "That's not what we were informed," they said. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. What I felt instead was confirmation. A slow, quiet validation that my instincts hadn't been wrong. Something was unraveling, and it wasn't because I was being petty or dramatic. It was because they'd built a system that relied on me while actively pushing me out of it. From that moment on, I stopped reacting and started preparing. The first thing I did was gather information, not by snooping or confronting anyone, but by reviewing my own records. Years of emails, old agreements, notes I'd kept out of habit more than intention. I'd always been meticulous. At the time, it was just how my brain worked. Now it felt like foresight. Patterns emerged quickly, decisions that had been deferred to me, responsibilities I'd been given verbally but never formally transferred, access that existed because I'd created it, not because it had ever been reassigned. And most importantly, obligations that still pointed in my direction despite their attempts to quietly remove me from the picture. They had tried to erase my presence without understanding how deeply embedded it was. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not friends, not extended family. This wasn't about rallying support or venting frustration. This was about control. And control, I was learning, came from knowing more than the other side assumed you did. At the same time, I began tightening my boundaries further. I redirected mail, updated contact points, confirmed my own documentation was current and airtight. Anything that touched my name, my responsibility, or my authority got reviewed. Slowly, methodically. No rush. I wasn't racing anyone. The pressure was on them, not me. Meanwhile, my family's attempts to pull me back grew more frantic. My father called late one evening, the tone of his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He said we needed to talk, that there were misunderstandings, that things had become unnecessarily complicated. He asked when I could come by. I told him I wasn't available. The silence on the line was heavy. Then he said something that would have rattled me months ago. "You're being difficult, Felix." I let that sit. Then I replied, evenly, "I'm being clear." He hung up without another word. That interaction confirmed something important. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They weren't trying to repair the relationship. They were reacting to pressure. External pressure. The kind that doesn't respond to guilt or emotional appeals. That meant time was on my side. I began speaking to people I trusted, not to complain, but to verify. Quiet conversations. Hypothetical questions. I was careful not to overshare. I didn't need allies in the traditional sense. I needed perspective. And what I heard, again and again, reinforced the same conclusion. The way my family had handled things wasn't just unkind. It was reckless. At some point, Aaron tried a different approach. He showed up again, this time unannounced but oddly polite. He brought coffee, acted casual, talked about stress, about how things had gotten out of hand. He avoided specifics, which told me everything I needed to know. At one point, he said, "Look, we're all just trying to keep things from blowing up." I asked him what exactly he thought was about to blow up. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he said, "You know, stuff." That was when I realized how little he actually understood. He'd stepped into a role he wasn't prepared for, backed by confidence he hadn't earned. He thought proximity to authority was the same as authority itself. It wasn't his fault entirely. He'd been raised to believe that access equaled entitlement. I told him I hoped things worked out and walked him to the door. After that, the tone shifted again. Messages came that were less demanding and more conciliatory. My mother apologized, sort of, not for what she'd said, but for how things felt. She talked about family sticking together, about legacy, about how people outside didn't understand us the way we understood each other. That word again, us. I didn't respond. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing. I made sure I understood exactly where my responsibilities began and ended. I documented everything. Dates, requests, changes attempted without my involvement. I didn't speculate or assume. I stuck to verifiable facts, the kind that holds up under scrutiny. What surprised me was how calm I felt throughout the process. There was no rush of adrenaline, no desire to hurt anyone. What I wanted, what I needed, was resolution, finality, a clean break from a dynamic that had drained me for most of my life. One afternoon, I received a message from someone entirely outside my family circle. Someone who had no emotional investment in the situation. They asked if I'd be available for a brief conversation to clarify some inconsistencies. That word, clarify, felt almost gentle. We spoke the next day. The conversation was professional, direct, and illuminating. They explained what they'd been told. I explained what I knew. When the call ended, they thanked me for my transparency and said they'd be in touch. I hung up and sat quietly for a long time. That was when I understood that the moment I'd been waiting for, the one that would shift everything, was no longer hypothetical. It was approaching, not because I'd pushed for it, but because the structure my family relied on could no longer support their assumptions. That evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Missed calls, texts, voicemails, all from my parents. The urgency in their messages was unmistakable now. No more soft language. No more nostalgia. Just requests framed as necessities. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed everything one last time. Not because I doubted myself, but because precision matters when lines are about to be drawn. I made sure every step I'd taken was defensible, every boundary clear, every decision deliberate. I wasn't preparing to lash out. I was preparing to step aside and let reality do what it does best. The next morning, I woke up to a single message from my father. Short, direct, uncharacteristically honest. We need to talk today. This is serious. I stared at the screen, feeling none of the old panic. Just readiness. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, then settled on something simple. Today works. Send me the details. As soon as I hit send, I knew there was no going back. Whatever conversation was coming would change how things stood between us permanently. Not because I intended to destroy anything, but because the illusion they'd been living under was about to collapse. And once it did, they would finally understand the difference between assuming control and actually having it. We met in a conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of neutral space designed to strip emotion out of conversations. My parents were already there when I arrived. My father stood as I entered, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. My mother didn't stand at all. She clutched her purse in her lap like a life raft, eyes flicking between me and the person seated at the far end of the table. That person nodded at me politely. Calm, professional, neutral in a way that immediately told me this wasn't a family discussion anymore. This was a matter of record. I took my seat without greeting anyone beyond a brief nod. No small talk. No easing in. The air was heavy enough already. The person at the end of the table began by outlining the situation. Slowly, carefully, they explained that several recent changes had been requested regarding certain arrangements my parents had relied on for years. Those requests had triggered a review. During that review, discrepancies surfaced. Authority that had been assumed did not, in fact, exist. Responsibilities that had been reassigned had never been properly transferred. Then came the part I'd been quietly waiting for. They explained that much of what my parents considered their system had been structured, maintained, and overseen by me. Not informally, not casually, formally, documented. My name appeared again and again, not because I demanded it, but because I had been the one actually doing the work when others had simply benefited from it. My father shifted in his chair. My mother's grip tightened on her purse. The professional turned to me and asked a simple question. At this point, do you wish to remain involved? I didn't answer immediately. I looked at my parents instead, really looked at them, at the people who had told me I was living proof of failure, who had said I was no longer welcome, who had tried to erase me quietly when they thought I wouldn't notice. And I felt nothing sharp, no anger, no triumph, just clarity. I do not, I said. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. The rest unfolded quickly after that. Without my involvement, several arrangements could not continue as they had. Responsibilities would need to be redistributed, oversight reassigned. In some cases, paused entirely until proper authority was established. Timelines were mentioned, requirements outlined, consequences stated plainly, without drama. My parents tried to protest. Not loudly, not angrily, just with a growing edge of desperation. My mother said there must be some mistake. My father said this was all being blown out of proportion. They both looked at me, finally, like they were seeing me for the first time in years. The professional listened politely and then said something that felt like the final nail in the coffin of their assumptions. This isn't personal, they said. It's procedural. These structures rely on clear accountability. Without it, they can't function. Accountability. The word hung there, heavy and unavoidable. When the meeting ended, my parents asked if we could talk privately. The professional stepped out, leaving the three of us alone in the room. My mother spoke first. Her voice cracked, just enough to sound sincere. She said she never meant to hurt me, that things had gotten out of hand, that stress made people say things they didn't mean. I reminded her, calmly, of exactly what she'd said. Word for word. Living proof of failure. No longer welcome. My father tried a different approach. He said family should come first, that we shouldn't let technicalities tear us apart, that what mattered was sticking together. I asked him why sticking together had only ever meant me absorbing disrespect quietly. He didn't have an answer. That was when Aaron burst into the room, uninvited and visibly flustered. He looked at me like I'd betrayed him personally. He said I was overreacting, that I was punishing everyone over hurt feelings, that this was going too far. I told him, evenly, that consequences only feel extreme to people who never expect to face them. The fallout wasn't immediate in a dramatic sense. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a slow, painful realization settling in. Without me quietly holding things together, cracks became impossible to ignore. Deadlines were missed. Decisions stalled. People who had once been so confident suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand systems they'd never bothered to learn. Extended family took sides, then fell quiet when facts replaced assumptions. Friends of my parents stopped offering sympathy when they realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a pattern finally exposed. In the weeks that followed, my parents reached out repeatedly. Apologies became more direct, promises more specific. They offered compromises, then concessions, then desperation. They asked if we could start over. I declined, not out of cruelty, out of self-respect. I didn't cut them off with rage or speeches. I simply maintained the boundaries I'd set. I stopped filling gaps they'd created. I stopped rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. And without my quiet support, the version of stability they'd taken for granted collapsed into something far less comfortable. Meanwhile, my life kept improving. The work I'd rebuilt flourished. Opportunities I'd once dismissed as unrealistic became routine. I moved into a space that felt entirely mine. I slept better, laughed more, carried myself differently. People noticed, not because I told them anything had changed, but because it had. Months later, my mother sent one last message. No requests, no manipulation, just a simple line saying she hoped I was well. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I finally understood something she never had. Family isn't about access. It's about respect. And legal standing, unlike sentiment, doesn't bend to guilt. They told me I was living proof of failure. They told me I wasn't welcome. I took them at their word. And when they came knocking, they learned the difference between being related to someone and having any claim over their life at all.